This is U.S. History Regents Review. We're looking at court cases. This is our second video. We've talked about the Marshall Court and how it increased the power of the federal government over the states. We looked at how the Supreme Court has treated African Americans over time, for a large part limiting their rights, but later expanding their rights during the Civil Rights era. Now we're going to talk about rights as they relate to times of war. This court case, Schank versus United States, the issues came up during World War I. A man named Charles Schank was charged with violating the Espionage Act, passed during World War I, because he had distributed printed documents on how to avoid the draft. Schank appealed, saying that his First Amendment right to free speech was violated. So the question becomes, did the Espionage and Sedition Acts unfairly limit First Amendment rights? The decision is no. This ruling set a precedent that people's individual rights may be limited or suspended when there is a clear and present danger that threatens national security. In the opinion delivered by Oliver Holmes, he talked about how you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. Similarly, you can't just say anything that creates a clear and present danger. So on the Regents exam, they want you to know that this court case had to do with World War I. They want you to know that during a time of war, you have fewer rights. And they also want you to understand that First Amendment rights to freedom of speech are not unlimited. Korematsu versus United States. So this is during World War II. During World War II, due to strong anti-Japanese prejudice, Executive Order 9066, signed by FDR, was issued ordering anyone of Japanese heritage and living on the West Coast to relocate to an internment camp inland. Fred Korematsu, he refused to leave, which violated that order. So the question became, did Executive Order 9066, the Japanese internment, did that violate Korematsu's right to property and equal protection under the law? So let's think about the last example we looked at with Schank. During a time of war, what normally happens? Well, the decision was no. The order was issued based on special wartime needs. So this upheld the special wartime needs of the president and entitled the U.S. government to suspend the rights of an entire race of people. Later, 1988, the federal government formally apologized for this action, for the internment of Japanese American people, and paid those who were still alive $20,000 in reparations. So this was considered to be racially motivated, because you'll notice we didn't actually intern others we had been fighting during the war, like the Germans or Italians. So again, based on these cases, what conclusion can we draw? Well, during a time of war, you have fewer rights. We see this not just in these Supreme Court cases, but also in laws that are passed during times of war, including more vague wars, like, for example, the Cold War. Rights are taken away to fight communism. The War on Terror. Rights are taken away to protect the homeland from terrorists. But that also means increased power of government surveillance and limits on your freedoms of speech. The next court cases all take place during the 50s and 60s under the Warren Court. So this first one, Ernesto Miranda was convicted of kidnapping and raping an 18-year-old girl. His conviction was based on a confession during interrogation. He was kind of convinced and forced into signing off that he had done the crime. Miranda appealed, arguing that he was not informed of his rights prior to questioning. So were his rights violated? The answer is yes. Upon arrest, police must now issue what's called the Miranda Warning. That name came from this case, advising suspects of their right to remain silent and their right to a lawyer. Gideon versus Wainwright, 1963, same decade. This man, Clarence Gideon, was arrested for theft and did not have money for an attorney. When he asked for one, the Florida judge told him the state only provided lawyers for certain offenses. Gideon defended himself. He lost, sentenced to 5 years in prison. Gideon actually hand wrote an appeal to the Supreme Court. So it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the question was, did Florida violate Gideon's Sixth Amendment rights to due process? Sixth Amendment also says you have the right to an attorney. So yes, all states must provide counsel to those who cannot afford it. So the Bill of Rights, which protected people under federal laws, also applies to the states. Your right to an attorney includes state, criminal, or just general trials. Mapp versus Ohio. Cleveland police arrived at Dalry Mapp's house, searching for a fugitive, a person. She refused to let them in without a warrant. The police later returned, pushed Mapp aside, put her in handcuffs, and searched her apartment, where they found pornography, which was illegal in Ohio. Mapp was arrested. Were Mapp's Fourth Amendment rights violated? Yes. I mean, let's think about this. There was a lot of problems here. First of all, they were not actually in possession of a warrant. The police never showed her one. Second of all, they were looking for a fugitive, and they started searching through her stuff, and they found the porn in a trunk, and obviously a person would not fit in there. So they're going and looking for other things. Even if there had been a warrant, it would never have been in there. So this creates what's called the exclusionary rule. Any evidence that the police obtain illegally cannot be used in a court of law against someone. And I always remember this court case because I think about a map. A map is used to search for something. So overall, what's the theme? How have the rights of the accused changed over time? All of these court cases were part of the time period when Chief Justice Earl Warren was leading the Supreme Court through the 50s and 60s. He was appointed by Eisenhower, who's a Republican, but he actually ended up having what we would call a really activist liberal court. And we would call this liberal because the court was really interested in expanding civil liberties and individual rights. So overall, all three of these, plus others we didn't talk about, expanded the rights of the accused. Our next court case, Engel versus Vittal, 1962. The Board of Education of a New York school, so the New York Regents, required students to recite a prayer at the beginning of each school day. And this was a non religion specific prayer, but it did kind of refer to God. Some parents challenged this, saying it was a violation of the First Amendment's Establishment Clause. The Establishment Clause of the First Amendment says there's a separation of church and state, like the government cannot establish a religion. This district argued the students were not forced to say the prayer, which was non-denominational. So they weren't forced to actually say it, but they would hear the prayer and they were present while it would be said. So does this prayer violate the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, the separation of church and state? The court, also this is the Warren Court, decided yes. Even though students were not forced to say the prayer, unwarranted pressure still existed for them to do so. So this court case officially banned prayer in public schools. Tinker versus Des Moines, also part of the Warren Court. This is during the Vietnam War. Mary Beth and John Tinker, their siblings, wore black armbands to school, along with a few other students, to protest the Vietnam War. This is against school policy, and they were suspended. The Tinkers sued, claiming their First Amendment rights were violated. So the question is, did the Tinkers have the right to symbolic speech as a form of protest in schools? The answer is yes. The armbands were protected as a form of free, silent, symbolic speech, according to the First Amendment. During the case, they said students don't surrender their constitutional rights at the gate of the schoolhouse, so long as the educational process is not disrupted. So as long as school is not disrupted, students still have political rights. They can express their political opinions. So overall, again, the Warren Court, how did the Warren Court expand First Amendment rights? We see symbolic speech is protected and separation of church and state are protected by the Warren Court.